Uh, as you get older, you tend to reminisce, go back to stories of younger, younger times. Uh, this is kind of, we'll be going beyond that. But to start out, I wanted to just tell you something that Jason Chisurai, he was here a couple of weeks ago. Do you remember the Chisurai family? They're a black family from Zimbabwe. And mother and father and 3 children. I think there were only 2 that were here last time. Two girls. Were there 3? Okay. And very musical. I think they've sung here before too. Anyway, Jason shares something with me, which I almost wish he hadn't. As just an aside, as we were sitting at the table, he said, Father Chabangu died. Father Chabangu? Yes, he died. When did that happen? Well, it was 1977 or 8, I think. Oh, that was 45 years ago. You're just telling me now. Well, I just found out about it a short time ago. And I tell you, the news, when he told me, it was like, it hit me in the chest. You know, I thought Father Chabangu would live forever. Back in, when we were at Salusi, 1965 to 70, you used to see Father Chabangu come to church every Sabbath. And he would walk. He was a very stately, dignified man. He would come to church. He was barefoot. And he was old then. He was barefoot, but he'd wear pants, he'd had them a long time. He wore a white shirt and a tie, and this black wool coat, overcoat kind of. And he wore it in the summertime. He wore it every time he came to church. The missionaries had taught them well. You wear suits, and they're black suits. Back in the day, he just seemed he was the patriarch of the Ndebele tribe in that area, and just a man that I so highly respected. Back in, I think it was about 1877, I think it was 1887. He was probably around 10 years old, because when he died, they didn't know exact birth, but they said it was between 100 and 106. So I estimate that back in 1887 or 88, he was probably around 10 years old. And as most of the young lads did in the Matabele land at that time, he would herd his father's cattle. And he would drive off any wild animals that came along. And you know, there were lions, there were leopards, there were cheetah. But they were brave young men. And so he grew and he grew until eventually he became a grown man. But I didn't want to tell you the rest of his story, because I actually don't know it. But what I want to do is kind of get things in perspective, time-wise. The 1800s, 1888 or 87, and about 6 years later, 1893. By that time, there had been a number of settlers that had moved into the southern part of South Africa, built up the town called Cape Town. And among them were Americans. And by 1893, some of them had become Seventh-day Adventists. And they had got a vision that they would like to see Adventism or Christianity, the news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, go further north to Matabele land. I don't know why they picked it, but there was an outpost, a fort, that the British had established in a town called Bulawayo, the place of blood. That was named by Lobengula back in the day. And so they had an outpost there. They had it was like a fort in some ways. And these Adventists in South Africa wanted to take the gospel up there. So they checked with the General Conference, got their blessing, and they went to Peter Wessel and Robinson. I forget his initials, but anyway, he's one of my relatives, by the way, by marriage. But they went to Cecil Rhodes, who was the prime minister in the colony in that part of Africa for the British Crown. And they asked him if they could have some land, if they would have his blessing if they went up north to Matabele land and established a mission up there. And while they were asking him this question, he just took out a piece of paper and he started writing. And when he finished writing, he put it in an envelope, sealed it, and he gave it to them. And he didn't tell them what was in it. He just said, when you get there, give this to Dr. Jemison. He's a representative for the Prime Minister here. And just give that to him and he'll take care of it. So that's what they did. They took a train from Cape Town to Freeburg. And from there, that was about 750 miles on a narrow gauge train. And I can tell you they aren't comfortable. But anyway, then from there they took an ox wagon. And ox wagons, they're very large. They make one of our Pioneers wagons seem rather small. Sometimes they would have as many as 16 oxen pulling the wagons because they had so much equipment. They had to take equipment to and food and supplies in order to live because they couldn't always know how, when they were going to get food other than what they would shoot. But I'm not sure if it was a 16 ox wagon, but anyway, I just kind of used my imagination. And they got up there and they saw Dr. Jemison and he took the letter and he read it and he kind of had a puzzled look on his face and he said, "Do you know what this says?" And, "No. It says that we are to give you 12,000 acres. 12,000 acres plus." And there were four, I didn't mention, four others that went with Peter Wessel and Robinson. And one of them at least was a woman. And he said that the four men you have with you can each one go stake out land, whatever he needs, around the 12,000 acres that you get. And that way they can have a farm and produce crops and so forth. Very generous, wouldn't you say? By the way, that was a very dry part of the country. And droughts were common. In fact, the first 4 years that they were there was a drought. And it was pretty bad. If it weren't for the kindness of the folks that lived there, the African folks, that part of the country was mainly with the Matabele tribe, although there were some Mashonas and some others. But they were very hospitable and kind to the missionaries, and they wanted to learn what they had to teach them. I'm getting beyond or leaving my notes here. Let's see, where was I? Oh yeah, it's another 700 miles from Freeburg that they had to go in ox wagon. That was the beginning of Salusi Mission, by the way. And I think, oh yes, I wanted to mention that the hazards which they lived and worked in included, one, the dry climate. I think I've already mentioned that. Two, there was hostility between the Mashonas and the Matabele. The Mashonas were a more agricultural people, not as much prone to fight. Not that they couldn't, but that wasn't their way of life. The Matabele, who actually were kind of an offshoot from the Zulus who lived further down in South Africa, they were more warlike people, and they did more hunting and for their food. So there were hostilities between them. And then there was a resentment of the native people because of the intrusion of the Europeans. By the way, I'll use the word Europeans anytime I'm speaking of white, because that's what that was to the African. Everybody was from Europe. They would recognize that some came from the United States, but they were still Europeans. So I'd rather use that word myself. So there was some resentment, and sometimes, particularly in Matabele, would rebel, and they would try to reclaim some of the land that had been given so generously by Cecil Rhodes, land that wasn't Cecil Rhodes's to give. It was free land. The concept of owning land wasn't part of their culture. And so they didn't like it. To complicate things worse, there was fighting and resentment between the English people in South Africa and the Boers, or the Afrikaners, who were from Holland. And so there were also snakes. I had the opportunity to see a leopard one night at Salusi, crossing the road in front of me, and wild pigs. Lions were no longer there when we were there. They were further afield, but the conditions were not easy. And when Faye and I got there, there was a political situation which we weren't aware of, and didn't take too much notice of at first, and that was, we got there in May of 1965, and in July of that year, no, sorry, it wasn't July, I forget, it was November 11, Independence Day, right? Well, voting day? Okay. Anyway, it was in November that Ian Smith declared independence from the British Crown. We called it UDI, or Unilateral Declaration of Independence. The result of that was that the United Nations declared sanctions on Rhodesia, or Matabele land. Well, they called themselves Rhodesian by that time. And the United Nations declared sanctions and placed embargoes on trade that came and went. And it made it hard for us to get gasoline or petrol and certain foods, basic foods like dry cereal. But anyway, so that was a challenge. And then later, of course, there was rebellion in Rhodesia, and there was guerrillas that were crossing the borders, and some of them were there already. And since the African population outnumbered the European population by 20 to 1, the outcome was inevitable, though the Europeans who lived there certainly didn't seem to realize that. And and by the way, so many of those Europeans were now second, third, maybe even fourth generation. So that was home to them. They grew up, they were born there, many of them. Kind of like with the Hispanic and African and Asian and Eastern European population in this country. You know, they immigrate just like all of us did, or our ancestors, and then it became home. So they felt like it was theirs as much as the Africans did. Um, and then in the government, there was not an equality there. So it was mostly a white-controlled and more of a police state. So we had to be careful in how we spoke and in any sentiments that we might have either way. And there was either way. We had Afrikaners who were teaching at Salusi, as well as those the English from South Africa. So that was quite a challenge. Anyway, that's not the story. I'm trying to lay the background, and I need to hurry along. At Salusi College, I joined Elder Jack Blanco in teaching the ministerial students. You may remember Jack Blanco was the creator of the Clear Word Bible translation. He was a wonderful man, I have to tell you. It was a privilege to work with him. At that time, he was working on his doctorate as well as the Clear Word. Faye worked in the library and enjoyed that, and we had our twin boys who eventually a little girl came along as well. The ministerial students at Salusi came from as far north as Rwanda and from as far south as Cape Town and all the countries in between. Plus, we had one student from India. I was interested to see that. So it's within the context of these tensions that I wanted to share this story. It was the middle of March, and Elder Blanco had scheduled a series of meetings in Harare. Harare was an African township of about 100,000 people within the city of Salisbury, which was the capital. That was where they were allowed to live, the Africans. There were reserves, there were tribal trust lands throughout the country, but it was tightly controlled. Anyway, so we're going to have meetings, and Elder Blanco was going to speak, and the students were going to learn, and I was going to learn as well as I assisted. Most of the people there spoke English, although some coming from the country would speak Ndebele or Sindebele or Mashona. But most of it was in English. So what I wanted to tell you was about a lady, I'm going to call her Mongwenya. I can't remember. She could have been Mondlovu, she could have been Masuku, could have been any number of the names, but I just chose Mongwenya. Ma is kind of like Mrs., by the way. It's just a prefix to anybody that's married, a woman. The man just called him either by his last name or you called him Baba, which is like father. It's a sign of respect. Oh, I got to read this from Matthew 12:1 before I get into the story of Mongwenya. Matthew 12:18-21 reads, and this is a quote from Isaiah, "Look at my servant whom I have chosen. He's my beloved, and I am very pleased with him. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations." I think we had part of that in our scripture reading. I know this is speaking of Jesus, but we are Jesus' ambassadors, his representatives here on earth. So we need to take it to heart. Verse 19, he will not fight or shout. He will not raise his voice in public. This was the New Living Translation. He will not crush those who are weak or quench the smallest hope. Until he brings full justice with his final victory, and his name will be the hope of all the world. And that's what we were trying to proclaim in Salisbury, in Harare. Monguenia was a lady who appeared to be in her late 40s, early 50s. She was intelligent, very pleasant lady. And she had accepted the message of salvation during the meetings and wanted to be baptized. There's one problem. She was a supervisor of a dormitory in Harare. Now, often we think of dormitory in connection with educational institutions. But these dormitories were buildings, apartment buildings that had single rooms. And the men would be in one dormitory, and the women would be in another dormitory, and the children would be with the women. And she was a supervisor for that. She had to work on Sabbath, and she didn't know what to do about that. She mentioned to her supervisor, another African lady, that she would like to have Sabbath off on Saturday. And the lady said, no, can't do it. So Mrs. Nguyen spoke to me after a meeting one night, and I suggested that she should talk to Mr. Richardson, who was a man in charge of a complex of dormitories, and see what she could do. She was kind of reluctant to do that because she'd already had a no from her immediate supervisor, and here now she has to go to the European, who's up there. You know, he could fire her if he wanted to, and so she was reluctant. But I encouraged her, and she said okay, and so she did. And when I saw her afterwards, I asked her, "What did he say?" He said, "No." He said, "You really need to go to your immediate supervisor." Well, she sort of had, but he said, "Well, you just tell her." I said that she should speak to her. And so she went again to this lady, and she put it a little more forcefully. "Mr. Richardson said I should speak to you." And the lady said, "No, I'm sorry, it can't be done. You have to work." So Monguenia came back to me, and she said, "Would you speak to Mr. Richardson for me?" Now, before I go further, I just got to tell you this little caveat, or whatever. A few nights before, I had been one of the men who had been attending the meetings was late, and there was no buses for him to get back home. And he lived in Salisbury. He was a gardener, did yard work, worked for a European man, and he had a little house in the backyard. That's where they would live. They could live within the city if they're living in the backyard and they're employed, the Africans that live there. And that was his position. And so I offered him a ride home, and I gave him a ride home, and he got out of the car, and he started up toward the driveway, and was going up the driveway, and dogs started barking, and the light came on, and the man of the house came out. He saw the car and saw me sitting in it, and I think he saw, I don't remember the man's name now. We could call him Sabanda. How's that? He saw Sabanda going up the road or the driveway, and the man came marching out to me. "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I just brought Mr. Sabanda back. He was attending meetings." And he got really angry with me. And he said, "He is and he used a derogatory term, mine, and you have no business bringing him here. I don't want to see him in your car again. I don't want to see you bring him here again. I don't want to see you again. And besides that, I've already called the police. So you just stay right here. And he stood there by the car. Okay. So I waited, not knowing whether the police are going to be friendly or whether they're going to be unfriendly. And they came, and he spoke to them. They said, okay. And they told me to wait. And they went up into the porch, and they talked with him, and then they came back. And they said, oh, this guy, he's just being himself. I could use another derogatory term like jerk or whatever, but I won't. Not anymore, anyway. Anyway, and they just laughed about it. I said, don't worry. We'll see that he doesn't bother you again. Anyway, so that's with that experience in mind, and Mrs. Nguyen now, or Ma Nguyen wants me to speak to Mr. Richardson. I was really not excited about that. Didn't want to do it. But I finally agreed. And so I went and I spoke to him. And he was so nice. He said, oh, just tell her to come see me and we'll work it out. I was so happy. The next night when I saw her at the meeting, I told her exactly what he'd said. And she didn't look quite as excited as I was, but she said she would go. And so I looked for her that Sabbath at church. She wasn't there. And I asked her the next day at the meeting, or that night, where were you? I thought you'd go see him. She said, I didn't. I was afraid. I was just too afraid to go see him. Folks, we don't know the fear that sometimes people have in their hearts, whether it has to do with prejudice, whether it has, with authority, whether it has to do with financial situations. It's all kinds of things. And I know for me, it was, I just thought, you know what? I went to see Mr. Richardson for you. I went to bat for you. And I was really looking positive. And you couldn't go see him again. There's nothing I can do more, And I sort of mentally, I didn't say that. I don't know what my face showed. But mentally, it was like, I guess I washed my hands because I've done what I can. I'm not proud of that. We learn lessons through the years. But here's what happened. The next Sabbath, we had a baptism, and as soon as the baptism was over, I went out of the church so I could greet people. I wasn't doing the baptizing. I went out to greet people as they came out. And when I went out, first person I saw was Mrs. Nguyen, Ma Nguyen. And I looked at her, Mrs. Nguyen, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I went to work this morning, and Mr. Richardson was there waiting for me. And he said, what are you doing here? And she told him, and she said, this is your Sabbath. I don't want to ever see you here again on your Sabbath. Isn't that incredible? And when she told me that, I said, oh, wow, thank you, Lord. That's a miracle. Those miracles are better than, pardon me, being cured of cancer and some other physical things. I suppose it's easy for me to say, not having experienced them yet. But to change somebody's heart, and God knows the pain and the fear that she was feeling. And he reached down and he touched Mr. Richardson's heart and gave her Sabbath off. It was beautiful. And I just wanted to share that. That's my mission story, that we just never know what people are going through. And sometimes we think nobody knows what we're going through. But I want you to know that God does. He cares about us. He knows our fears and our worries and our sense of guilt. And I think we just have so much to thank him for. And I would like to invite you to stand with me and sing our closing hymn of thanksgiving and praise to our Redeemer who knows our hearts and knows our lives and loves us beyond compare. Okay. 343. I will sing of my Redeemer. Sing, oh, sing of my Redeemer, with his love he purchased me. On the cross until my heart, the dead and wash me free. I will tell that faith faith in his boundless love and mercy. Sing, oh, sing of my Redeemer, with his on the cross he filled the grave that made me free.